welcome to the Acid Trash Jamboree, the home of weird and psychedelic music and films. Today we'll be taking a look at 3 CDs connected to Twisted Village, a US label run by a fella named Wayne Rogers, which started in the mid-80s and peaked in terms of its creative output in the 90s and early 2000s. Rogers also opened a shop of the same name at some point, though unfortunately this closed in 2010, after which the label's release schedule became much more sporadic. Now, despite being long obsessed with that whole glut of American experimental, psychedelic and improvised rock and folk music from the same era, for some reason Twisted Village passed me by for ages and I've still barely scratched the surface with their stuff, so yeah, this isn't going to be the most in-depth video ever made, but nonetheless, here's my thoughts on what I've got so far. We start with Magic Hour and their album Will They Turn You On or Will They Turn On You? Now, I realise that the edition I own is the UK Shea version, though Twisted Village did at least handle the US release of the CD, so that's close enough for me. Anyways, Magic Hour formed from the ashes of 2 separate psychedelic bands, comprising of the guitar duo of the aforementioned Wayne Rogers and his wife, Kate Bigar, who had previously played together in the last lineup of Rogers' band Crystallized Movements, and Galaxy 500's former rhythm section, Damon Krakowski and Naomi Yang. Will They Turn You On was their second full length, released in 1995, and yeah, this is just okay for the most part. The first half being made up of 5 kinda wishy-washy, oftentimes snail-paced songs, pitched somewhere between the fuzzy haziness of shoegaze and the more introspective end of US indie rock, topped off with sleepy, somewhat monotonous vocals and shot through with occasional West Coast guitar wig-outs. All the material here was written by Rogers, who favours simplistic, Velvet Underground-styled chord changes that you've no doubt heard countless times before, though thankfully Yang saves things from getting too predictable with a harmonious bass playing. That said, unless this is your first taste of 90s indie-than-thou slacker rock, then you'll have no doubt heard the component parts of Magic Hour's sound done so much better and more memorably by a ton of other bands. Low, Red House Painters, Flying Saucer Attack, Ride, Dinosaur Jr. Yeah, take your pick. The 6th and final piece, the 20-minute long Passing Words, plays out like the logical culmination of all that's gone before, mixing up brief song sections with longer stretches of Bardo Pond-esque psychedelic modal jamming and the odd interlude of droning dual axe feedback. Nice enough stuff as far as these kinds of side-long indulgences go, though, save for the noisy, atonal freakiness towards the end, it's all pretty predictable, polite even. Yeah, you could level the same criticism at this extended workout too, that basically you can hear this sort of thing done way more convincingly elsewhere. Yeah, the aforementioned Bardo Pond's discography for starters, whilst contemporaneous Fushit Susha would have eaten this lot for breakfast and still had room for a side order of Sonic Youth, though maybe that's a slightly unfair comparison point. Still, as a record, this is far from terrible, with a couple of the songs, Jonathan and Charles in particular, touching on the kind of end of summer, wistful, nostalgic melancholy that I always like to hear, so that's something. Though overall, the album's highly unlikely to ever become an all-time favourite. On to Infraction, Wayne Rogers' 4th solo album, recorded between 1995 and 1996, then released in 97. Now, the early stages of this all-instrumental, 11-part composition see Rogers easing both himself and us listeners into things, laying down more of those tasteful, acidic raga blues solos over minimalist loops and grooves, which are interspersed with more avant-garde interludes, from mysterious hammered dulcimer wanderings to all-out atonal synthesizer chaos. From this point on, Rodgers then really starts opening out on the guitar, letting rip over more obviously 80s and 90s indie rock inspired backing tracks. From skulking Sonic Youth styled menace to almost grungy frippery, the 7th track sounding like some strange hybrid of early Nirvana and Soundgarden. The 9th part is both the longest and arguably the freest and noisiest on the album, opening deceptively with some standard issue propulsive hard rock, then giving way to an extended stretch of fuzz-wah axe torture, which finds Rodgers going full-bore Hendrix, stopping just short of setting fire to the bloody thing. After all that amp-frying bluster, the second to last section plays out like a bit of an anticlimax, if I'm being honest, returning us to the mellow, krauty grooving of the early stages, before Rodgers closes things out with some fairly menacing fuzz organ dronage. The same kind of skull-shaking, bowel-churning key sustain that would have sounded right at home on Soft Machine's 3rd, 20-odd years earlier. So there we have Infraction. Whilst it's a bit too episodic to convince as a truly flowing musical suite, and occasionally runs out of steam, Rodgers plugging the gaps with yet more noodly guitar soloing instead of doing something a bit more interesting. It's still a worthy addition to the collection, and at just over 40 minutes is short enough to not outstay its welcome, even during its least inspired moments. Again, if you enjoy what the likes of Bardo Pond were doing around about this time, then you'll surely get something out of this. As suggested at the start of the video, despite owning this for a few years, it's still the only one of Rodgers' solo works that I own at present, but I definitely wouldn't be averse to picking up more on the strength of this re-listen. Fittingly enough, finally we have Last Day's Boogie, the soul album from the project known as Wormdoom. And yes, surprise, surprise, but this was another group featuring Wayne Rodgers, again playing alongside his wife, Kate Biggar, as well as some folks that I'm not too familiar with, all of whom were connected to other Twisted Village projects like The Monster, who I really should get around to checking out as well. Anyways, apparently Wormdoom had been kicking about since the very early 90s, the first fruits of their labour being a comp appearance on the notorious UK label Shock in 1993, though it wasn't until 96 that Last Day's Boogie saw the light of day. The brief title track gets things underway with a nice bit of galloping Sabbath worship, all brutal power chord chugging and tin can drum smashing, which soon breaks down into stumbling, wailing chaos. And as we'll get onto, it's actually a good indicator of what's to come later on in the record. The first part of The Gift of Tongues follows, and sure enough, this features some rather unhinged vocals atop the group's wired and wiry jamming, the track suggesting that Wormdoom were well up on what was happening with the PSF label out of Japan around about the same time. On the other hand, the second part of The Gift of Tongues is a touch less exciting, still overlaid with the loony phonetic hollering, but this time backed by what you might call more common or garden bluesy garage rocking. But these short tunes only account for about 6 or 7 minutes of playing time. Yeah, the main meat of the album comes in the form of the remaining pieces, a quartet of loose, open-ended and ultimately very noisy improvised wig-outs, ranging from 6 to a whopping 15 minutes in duration. And yeah, unlike on the other 2 records discussed here, where, as I've pointed out, there was a lot of focus on traditional guitar solos that, as enjoyable as they can be, if you're anything like me at least, you've heard a million times before. Thankfully, here things are way more about all-out freaky abandon. Yeah, curious modal half riffs, stretches of effects pedal weirdness and disturbed squeals of feedback twist and writhe amorphously into endless configurations of free rock excellence, barely held together by rickety, ever-shifting drum and bass grooves. Just to bring PSF records up again for a second, I know I was a bit mean on Magic Hour earlier, suggesting they were no match for the likes of contemporaries like Fushitsusha. Well, here at least, in a few spots, Rogers & Co. actually give High-Nose Mob a decent run for their money. Elsewhere, I'm reminded of that beautiful period in Skullflower's discography, circa Carved into Roses and Infinity Land, where they ditched the big, lumbering bass lines and were more about loose-limbed rhythms and, crucially, lovely squalling sheets of psychedelic feedback bliss. For me, the highlight of last day's Boogie is the closer, the suitably rumbling A Distant Thunder, which plays out almost like a 90s update of Ashra Temple's cataclysmic Amboss, the sidelong monster opener from their debut album. Yeah, building from a freeform storm of speaker-burning string skronk and relentless tom-thumping, in the second half, Wormdoom really start cooking on gas, locking in and going for the jugular with the tightest and most focused jamming on the whole CD, finally busting out with some white-hot soloing as the track hurtles towards its apocalyptic conclusion. So yeah, that's Wormdoom for you. Aside from a live 7-inch, also from 96, unfortunately, no other recordings of theirs have emerged, which is a great shame actually, as in my house at least, you can never have too much of this fuzzed out noise rock madness. Okay, so hopefully this very small overview of Twisted Village music has been interesting. As time goes by, I fully intend on educating myself further on their wares, but yeah, for now this is all I've got. Thanks as ever for watching. Stay tuned to the channel if you want to hear about further cool, tripped out music by hitting the subscribe button. And yeah, I'll catch you again soon on the next edition of the Acid Trash Jamboree.